The first thing Damien did when he saw me across the restaurant was look straight through me. Not past me, through me. The way you look through a window when you're searching for something more interesting on the other side of the glass. His laugh reached me half a second later, deep and practiced, landing perfectly for the woman beside him in the cream blazer, and I stood there holding my takeout bag with both hands, 5 feet from his table, watching the man who had kissed me goodnight 3 days earlier pretend I was a coat rack. I did not move for what felt like a very long time. A server almost walked into me. The woman in the blazer said something, and Damien tilted his head the way he did when he was listening hard, the gesture I had found so specifically attractive in those early weeks because it looked like someone deciding you were worth the full weight of their attention. He directed it at her now with the same ease he had directed it at me, and I had the vertiginous experience of watching a quality I had thought was mine turn out to be transferable. I left without saying a word. On the drive home, I spent 23 minutes manufacturing explanations. He was with a colleague, and it would have complicated the dynamic. He had frozen. Some people freeze in moments of social collision, the brain seizing up, not producing the right response until after the elevator doors have closed. He had seen me and calculated, in the half-second available, that any acknowledgement would have required an introduction he wasn't ready to make, and he had erred toward the coward's option of simply not engaging. Any of these could be true. I wanted one of them to be true. I assembled them in the dark of the car and held them up one by one and chose to keep all of them. A whole shelf of reasons, rather than sit with the simpler reading that my body had offered me in the restaurant, and that I was now actively refusing. He texted me at 11:17 that night. Thinking about you. Miss your voice. I looked at my phone for a long time. I should have typed, I saw you tonight. 4 words. The door open. The invitation to explain. The kind of message that would have required him to step out from behind the story and say something that cost him something. I should have sent it without softening it or providing the exit ramp of context, just the plain statement of what had happened and a silence that needed to be filled. Instead, I wrote, "Miss yours too." I turned off my lamp. I lay in the dark and told myself that what I had seen was not what I had felt it was. That was the first night I protected his secret on his behalf. At the time, I thought I was protecting the relationship. Looking back at it now, from this side, I understand those are not the same thing. We had met 7 weeks earlier through mutual friends at a gallery, opening neither of us had genuinely wanted to attend. My friend Priya had done what she occasionally did, issued what she called an invitation, but which was structurally closer to a requirement, and I had dressed for it resignedly and arrived already planning my exit. He was standing in front of a painting that looked, to me, precisely like someone had sneezed on a canvas, waited for it to dry, framed it, and charged $9,000 for the sneeze. I said so under my breath, not calculating for an audience. He turned around, tall, which I noticed, dark jacket. Not remarkable on first look, but with the quality of attention in his face that would keep coming back to me later, and he laughed. Not the social kind. Something shorter, caught off guard, more honest than he'd probably intended. He said, "I was going to say 8,000, but honestly." His name was Damien Holt. I filed it away as a person I had talked to at a party, which is a file that empties itself by morning in most cases. This one did not. He found me again near the wine before I left. We talked for 40 minutes about a subject I cannot now reconstruct. Something about cities and what makes one feel like itself versus feel like an imitation of itself. And he had opinions that were specific and sometimes wrong in interesting ways, and I found myself disagreeing with him about something, and he leaned into the disagreement rather than out of it, which is rarer than it should be, and which I have learned since to read as its own kind of skill. He texted 2 days later. He was direct about it in a way I found disarming. Not, "It was great to meet you. We should do this again sometime," the soft language of someone maintaining optionality. He said, "I've been thinking about the thing you said about cities pretending. Do you want to keep that argument over dinner?" We had dinner. Then we had more dinners. Then the dinners became evenings that extended past dinner, past the restaurant, into walking, into sitting somewhere talking past the hour when it was reasonable to still be sitting. And then past that into the particular hours where the talking grows quiet, and what remains between two people is just the fact of them. He was, in those first weeks, extraordinary at the details. He remembered that I couldn't eat cilantro, and that my mother's birthday was the 14th of the month, and that I had mentioned, exactly once and barely in passing, a neighborhood in Lisbon I'd read about in a novel and planned someday to visit. He sent me a photograph of it one Tuesday morning. No message. Just the image of a pale yellow building with green shutters, afternoon light across the stone, and a single question mark. That is an extraordinarily efficient way to make a person feel seen. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters. What he was doing was not a trick in the crude sense, not something you could have pointed to at the time and called manipulation. He was genuinely curious about me. The attention was real. The care in the details was real. What was not real, what I would understand much later, was the container, the frame around the real things, the category into which he was placing me and within which he was keeping me, carefully, without my knowledge, and without anyone in his external life knowing I existed. The second time he didn't know me, we were in an elevator. It was a Tuesday afternoon in mid-December. I had been meeting a client 2 blocks from his office and had stopped in to say hello because we had been doing that. Stopping in, the casual geography of two people whose lives have started to overlap. He was in the lobby on his way back from somewhere. We had approximately 90 seconds of easy conversation before the elevator arrived, and we stepped in. A colleague of his, gray-suited, 60-something, the kind of man who moves through rooms as though he has already assessed them and found them acceptable, stepped in just before the doors closed. Damien shifted beside me, almost imperceptibly. A quarter step to the left, the distance between our arms opened by exactly the amount required to make us not a unit. The colleague spoke to Damien about something work-related, and then glanced at me with the polite blankness of an implied question. Not intrusive, just the ordinary social gesture of someone waiting to be given context for the stranger in the elevator. Damien said, "Just sharing the elevator." The doors opened on the 14th floor. The colleague stepped out. I stayed where I was and watched the numbers climb and felt something settle into my chest like sediment into the bottom of a jar. Sediment is quiet. It doesn't crash. It just descends, and then it stays. We were going to my floor because we'd planned to have lunch nearby. In the corridor, Damien said something about how awkward elevator small talk was in professional settings, and laughed. And I laughed too, and somewhere in that laughter I swallowed the question I was forming and replaced it with silence. That evening, he brought flowers. Dahlias, my favorite, which he knew. And he was warm and funny and told a long, well-constructed story about a meeting that had gone badly in a satisfying way, and then he pulled me close on my couch with the ease of someone returning to something familiar, and I sat there inside all of that warmth and told myself, people are complicated. The professional world is its own territory. He was caught off guard. It doesn't mean what you felt it meant for a moment in the elevator. By then, the not meaning what it meant was a practiced reflex. I deployed it with the efficiency of something that has been used many times before and found reliable. When I brought it up, not the elevator specifically, but the broader pattern of it, the way I seemed not to exist in the external shape of his life. I chose a Saturday in late February, a morning that felt open enough to hold a difficult conversation. We were having coffee at my kitchen table. I had planned the approach the night before. I wanted to be specific without being accusatory, to ask rather than declare, to leave him room. I said, "I notice that when we're around people from your work, you introduce me differently than you might introduce someone you're close to." He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone caught, the quiet of someone choosing the right key. Then he said, his voice carrying the specific texture of someone who is trying not to show that they're hurt, "I didn't realize you needed external proof. I thought what we had was real enough to stand without it." That sentence. I have returned to it many times since. What it does, grammatically, is relocate the problem. My observation about his behavior becomes evidence of my own insecurity. The lack of external acknowledgement becomes the natural posture of someone who values the relationship for itself rather than for how it looks. And the implicit question, in my words, "Why are you hiding this?" gets answered with a counter-question. "Why does it need to be performed?" He then said, quieter, "I didn't think you were the kind of person who needed that," which is almost more elegant than the first sentence. "Because I didn't think you were the kind of person puts me in the position of either accepting the framing, 'I'm not that kind of person, you're right, this doesn't matter,' or rejecting it, which requires me to claim that I am, in fact, the kind of person who needs external validation, which he has just established as a lesser kind of person to be." I apologized. I apologized for raising it. I said I understood, of course, that the relationship didn't need to be performed. He kissed my forehead. We finished our coffee. We moved on. I have thought about that morning many times since then, about how completely he turned the conversation around and handed it back to me as evidence of my own failing. About how skilled that was. And about how long I spent afterward believing that I had, in fact, been the problem. The thing about being kept in a particular place is that it requires the cooperation of the person being kept there. Keeping someone requires that they not name what is happening, not ask the direct question, not hold still long enough to let the full shape of things become visible. And the way you prevent that, the way someone like Damien prevented it, is not through force or explicit prohibition, but through a constant low-level management of your emotional temperature. Enough warmth that you never get cold enough to see clearly. Enough disruption that you never settle long enough to accumulate evidence. A text at 11:17. A voice note from somewhere private in his own home. Flowers on a Tuesday. You're the only person I can actually talk to. Carefully maintained at just the degree required to keep the thing going without giving it a name that would make it dangerous to him. I had been cooperating. I had been cooperating so thoroughly that I had not even understood it as cooperation. I thought I was being patient, emotionally intelligent, not the kind of person who makes demands. What changed was a Wednesday afternoon in late March. His colleague, the gray-suited man from the elevator, whose name I would learn shortly, came into the cafe where I sometimes worked on my laptop in the slow part of the afternoon. He sat 2 tables over with a black coffee and a manila folder and read through something with the attention of a person who does not require entertainment from his surroundings. After 20 minutes, he looked up and recognition moved across his face, and he said, "You were in the elevator." Couple of months back. His name was Gerald. He had been with the firm for 11 years. We talked for 25 minutes. The easy conversation of 2 people with no stakes who happened to be in the same room. and he was kind in the unperformed way of someone who doesn't need you to like him and therefore just behaves decently as a default. He told me a story about a project that had gone sideways in an almost funny way. He mentioned, mid-story, that Damien had been handling the aftermath and that it had kept him busy, barely home even on weekends, though apparently he and Celeste had managed to get to Barcelona for a few days before it all started. I said, Celeste? He said, with the mildly puzzled look of someone who has said a self-evident thing and found it received with confusion, his wife. Do you know her? I said something that was technically a collection of words. Something that navigated the gap between no, because I did not know she existed, and yes, tell me everything. Something that landed apparently as a plausible response, because Gerald nodded and moved on, and I sat across from him for another few minutes, constructing the appearance of a person who was still in the same conversation they had been in before. Then I thanked him for the coffee, and I walked to my car in the attached parking garage, and I sat in the front seat with both hands on the steering wheel for 29 minutes. I know it was 29 minutes because I checked the time when I sat down, and then again when my hands had stopped shaking enough to text Priya, "Can you come over tonight?" Something happened. Priya was at my door by 7. She had brought wine she didn't ask if I wanted, and she set it on the counter, and then she sat down across from me, and she said, "Tell me everything. In order. Don't editorialize." I told her in order. She didn't editorialize either. She asked 3 clarifying questions over the course of it, all practical, all specific. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Okay. What do you have that can be pointed to?" What I had. Laid out. 4 months of paying separately at every restaurant, which he had established early and called a preference for financial independence. A key to his apartment that I had used exactly twice, always by specific invitation, never unexpectedly. Not one photograph of the two of us in any accessible space, not on his phone's social profiles, not in any location I had ever seen. A pattern of contact that began late at night and ended by early morning. Friends of his who had met me twice in controlled settings and who had been warm in the vague way you are warm to someone you don't expect to encounter again. No knowledge of where he spent his weekends when we weren't together. No knowledge of a wife. Priya looked at her notes. She said, "Has he ever said anything about being in a relationship? Separated? Anything like that?" Once, early on. He had mentioned being in a long relationship that had ended badly. Past tense, conclusive. Delivered with the light grimace of someone who found the subject painful. I had not pressed. I had been trying to be careful with him. She said, "What I want to know is whether anything is in your name, whether you've signed anything, whether there's any paper trail that includes you in his life." There wasn't. She said, "That's actually good." Not comfortingly, practically, the way someone assesses a situation and identifies the least damaged outcome. Now, messages? I had them across 3 platforms. His preference, which I had accommodated, because I had accommodated nearly everything. Text, a chat app, and occasional voice notes for the ones where tone mattered. She told me to forward everything to 2 separate email addresses. She told me not to delete anything. She told me not to contact him, and not to change anything about how I was behaving until we had reviewed what we had. She said it with the authority of someone who has watched her parents do this for 30 years. I did exactly what she said. While I was doing it, systematically forwarding, organizing, building the file that would prove to a third party what had happened to me, I noticed something about the act of documentation itself. For 4 months, I had been the person who gave things the benefit of the doubt, who held the evidence loosely, who interpreted generously and extended patience, and chose, repeatedly, the explanation that kept the story livable. Documentation is the opposite of that. Documentation says, this is what happened. This is the date, and the time, and the specific words, and the audio that plays back exactly the same way every time, regardless of how you're feeling about it. It doesn't care what you need it to mean. It is what it is, in the same form, every single time you return to it. I found that I had missed that quality. Reliability. The solid floor feeling of a thing that does not shift depending on who is in the room with it. What I also found, going through everything systematically, was the timeline. Not the emotional timeline, I already knew that one intimately, but the factual one. The first text had been sent 14 days after the gallery opening. The first time he hadn't introduced me was 9 days after that. The elevator was in week 17. The kitchen table conversation where I had apologized for asking about it was week 19. The weekend he was traveling for the project, the weekend of the audio, was week 22. A timeline is a different kind of document than a feeling. A timeline says, at this point, this was already true, and still this happened next. I spent the next 4 days inside the messages. Not the way I had read them before, with one eye sympathetic, running every possible interpretation through the filter of what I needed to believe. I read them the way I would read a document I'd been handed without emotional context. Looking for what was actually on the page, the text told a very consistent story once the editorial lens was removed. Week 7, you're the only person I can actually talk to, and I don't know why that is, but I'm grateful for it. Week 10, I keep thinking about somewhere quieter. Somewhere neither of us knows anyone. Maybe Europe. Maybe we finally see Portugal. Portugal. He had come back to Portugal. He had sent me that photograph with a question mark, and I had understood it as an implicit promise. Not stated, nothing that could be pointed to, but deeply felt. And he had used it again and again as a floating referent for a future we were building together. It was beautiful language. It was also, I understood now, the linguistic equivalent of the restaurant and the elevator, present enough to feel real, deniable enough to mean nothing in front of a third party. Week 12, a Tuesday evening, there's no version of the next chapter I can picture clearly that doesn't have you in it. I want you to know that. I had read that message at the time and held it for a long time before I could put my phone down. I read it now and noticed something I had not noticed before. It contained no facts, no dates, no specifics, no nouns that would require him to have named what we were. It was structured, with considerable skill, to produce the emotional experience of a commitment without constituting one. And if I had ever shown it to anyone, that person could have read it and said, this is someone who cares about a friend. Nothing in it was indefensible. Everything in it was calculated. Almost nothing I could point to. Almost 1 week before the elevator, during a weekend where he had said he was traveling for a project, I had sent a voice note. Missing him, the kind of message that arrives out of the space between tired and attached, where you stop calculating how you sound and you just say the thing. He had replied not in text, but in audio. 41 seconds. His voice, lower than usual, in a room I recognized by its specific acoustic quality, the slight reverberation off high ceilings, the particular quiet as his apartment, saying, I'm thinking about you every minute. I want you to know that. There is no place I would rather be than wherever you are tonight. He had been in his apartment. He had walked somewhere far enough from whoever was in his apartment with him that he couldn't be heard. A bathroom, a walk-in closet, a back hallway, and he had recorded 41 seconds of sincerity for me to hold. He had been in his apartment, and his wife had been in his apartment, and he had left the room to tell me there was no place he would rather be. I forwarded the audio to myself, then to the second address, then to Priya, with a single line, "This one doesn't read two ways." The deadline arrived on a Thursday without my designing it. He texted, "Are you free Saturday? I'd like to come over. There's something I want to talk about, something important." I had never received the word important from him before. I searched the entire thread. Not once, across 4 months, had he used it. The word important from someone who has always avoided specificity is a specific signal. It means he has concluded that a conversation is necessary and has decided to be the one who initiates it on his terms, rather than wait for it to arrive on mine. Priya and I were sitting at my kitchen table when it came in. She read it over my shoulder. She said, "Gerald. Gerald mentioned you to him. Or Damien noticed something was different this week and ran it back. Either way, he knows, and he wants to be the one who controls the frame of what happens next." I said, "Or he just wants to come over." She looked at me. She said, 4 months and he's never used that word. On Saturday, he's going to arrive with a prepared version of what this has been. It will be designed to make you feel that you have misunderstood something that was genuine. It will not be something you can argue against, because it will be precisely calibrated to use your own feelings as evidence of your own unreliability. He will leave you holding the experience, but without the vocabulary to call it what it was. I knew she was right. I could already hear the version he would bring. The careful quiet of his voice, the way he would look at me with something that resembled hurt, genuine enough that I wouldn't be able to call it performed, and say that he had cared about me, really cared, but that I had placed a construction on something that had never been exactly what I'd imagined, and that he was sorry I was in pain, and that his feelings had been real even if the situation had been complicated. He would use the word complicated 4 or 5 times. It would do a lot of work. Priya said, "You need to send something tonight, before he arrives with a prepared room and puts you in it." I typed for 30 minutes, deleted all of it, typed again, shorter, and deleted that too. Everything I wrote sounded either too small, like someone carefully moderating their own anger into acceptability, or too large, like someone performing a scene. Neither was right. What I wanted was accurate, not performed, not calibrated for his comfort. I typed it at 11:40 at night, which was his hour, which I had absorbed without noticing. I know about Celeste. I have the audio from the weekend you were traveling. Don't come Saturday. Don't contact me again after this, and if you're considering what I might do with what I have, I'd think carefully about that before you decide how to respond, because I've had a great deal of quiet time recently to think about what I'm willing to do. 3 minutes of silence. Then, please, can we talk? I can explain the situation. It's not what it looks like. Then, there's a lot of context you don't have. I owe you that conversation. Then nothing. The typing indicator appeared and disappeared 5 times over the next 14 minutes. Whatever he had prepared, he reconsidered. Whatever argument he had built in the 3 minutes before he started typing, he decided was insufficient. He has not contacted me since. The practical aftermath was quieter than I'd anticipated. Priya came over the following day, and I gave her the key and told her to return it however she wanted. She dropped it in an envelope with no note through the building mail slot the same afternoon, which was exactly right. I went through the apartment and found the objects that had accumulated as a kind of territorial marking. A jacket left on a hook, a charger he hadn't mentioned needing back, a book he'd loaned me and asked me to hold on to, a bottle of wine he'd said he'd collect. things designed to produce a reason for return. I boxed them and put them in my car and dropped them with the building's front desk with a sticky note that said only his name and apartment number. I did not post anything. I did not tell anyone who might tell him. I kept the forwarded audio files in 3 locations. I kept Gerald's name and the date of our conversation written in the Notes app on my phone. Not because I was planning to do anything with any of it, but because I had spent 4 months refusing to document what was happening to me in real time. And I was finished with that. I went about my ordinary week. I worked. I had dinner with Priya on Friday. I did not cry the way I thought I might, which was either composure or numbness, and I wasn't sure which. Probably some of both. Probably they looked the same from the outside. What I felt most consistently was not grief, or at least not primarily grief. What I felt was a particular kind of fatigue at having spent so much of the past 4 months working very hard on a story that was not true. I have thought a great deal in the weeks since about the nature of what he was doing. There is a version of this story that frames what Damien did as simply the behavior of a person who was in a bad marriage and made a dishonest choice. That frame is accurate as far as it goes. But it misses something specific about the method. The method was not merely deception. Deception would have been, he lied about being married. That happened, yes, but the method was also a set of structures that made it very difficult for me to know I was being deceived. And then, when the evidence accumulated enough that I felt something was wrong, further structures that redirected that feeling back onto me as evidence of my own inadequacy. The sentence at the kitchen table. I thought what we had was enough to stand on its own. That sentence did something very particular. It took my perception, something is wrong with how I exist in your life, and converted it into evidence of a flaw in my character. My need for external acknowledgement became proof that I didn't really value the relationship for itself. My discomfort at being just sharing the elevator became evidence of insecurity. Every time I felt what I felt, there was a pre-built response available that made the feeling the problem rather than what had produced the feeling. This is a particular kind of cruelty. Not because it's loud. It isn't loud. It's very quiet. It operates in the registers of warmth and reassurance and apparent care. It works precisely because the person doing it is also, in some genuine ways, the thing they are performing. He did remember things about me. The Portugal photograph was real. The attention was real. That's what makes the container so difficult to see. The real things are inside it, and you spend all your time looking at the real things instead of looking at the container. What I understand now, sitting on the far side of it, is that the person I needed to trust was not him. The person I needed to trust was the one standing in the restaurant holding a takeout bag, who knew immediately and completely and without any ambiguity what she was looking at, and then spent 23 minutes in a car constructing the reasons she was wrong. She was not wrong. She has never been wrong. She has only been overruled. The key is still on my ring. I've been thinking about why. It's not sentiment. I'm clear enough about what he was that sentiment seems imprecise. It's something more like documentation. The key is the only physical proof that I existed in his life in a form that required an object. You don't give someone a key to a space you don't need them to have access to. The key was real. What it meant was not what I thought it meant. But the key itself was real, and I find that I am not ready to give back the only thing of his that isn't deniable. Maybe that changes. Maybe in another month I mail it somewhere with nothing attached, and that is the full conclusion of the thing. But tonight it's still there. And I think what I'm holding on to is not him. I know exactly who he was now, but the version of myself who received it and believed what it meant. The version who was not wrong about the feeling. The one who only made the mistake of trusting the explanation more than the data. I don't want to do that anymore. To the version of me who trusted him, she deserved better than to be used as a surface for his management. And to the version of me who knew in the restaurant and then drove home and assembled the counter-argument, she was right. She was right at the first moment. And every hour between that moment and the one in the parking garage after Gerald was an hour I spent paying the cost of her being overruled. I won't overrule her again. Before I go, I need to ask you something. I mean this genuinely, not as a formula, not as the expected ending to the kind of story you watch at night when you're already halfway to sleep. I want to ask you to sit with this for a moment before you scroll past it. Have you ever been in a room with someone who looked straight through you and spent the drive home constructing explanations that kept them innocent, when somewhere in your body, the place that knows things before the mind gives them permission, the first version was already completely correct? And is there someone in your life right now, someone whose story you have been quietly revising week after week, adjusting the shape of the thing until it fits inside something you can live with, when the shape you felt before you started adjusting was probably the honest one? You don't have to name them in the comments. But I think there's someone reading this who has been carrying the cost of someone else's lie and calling it love, because that required less courage than calling it what it was. Write it down. Say it somewhere. You're not imagining it. You never were. Subscribe if this story found you where you are. A new one every week. A note on what I've left out and why. People who hear this story often ask a version of the same question. Why didn't you look him up earlier? Google him. Social media. The ordinary due diligence of the contemporary dating landscape that would have surfaced a wife in about 4 minutes. It's a fair question. The answer is uncomfortable. Partly it's practical. His social profiles were minimal and privacy locked, which I had read as the reasonable preference of a professional in a public-facing field. His name produced business results, not personal ones. I had not dug, because the profile of him that I was building felt full enough from the inside that I hadn't thought to look for the outer walls. But partly, and this is the part I don't enjoy saying, I didn't look, because looking felt like an accusation, like an admission that I suspected something was wrong. And suspecting something was wrong meant sitting with the possibility that what I had thought was real might not be, and that possibility was one I had been consistently routing around since the restaurant. Looking felt like crossing into the territory of paranoia. He had told me I wasn't the kind of person who needed external validation. I wanted to be that person. So I was, in a particular sense, performing the trust I thought the relationship required, even while, somewhere below the performance, the knowledge was already forming. What I understand now is that looking is not an accusation. It is ordinary care for yourself. It is asking the world to confirm that the story you're being told has a shape that corresponds to reality. There is no version of that which is an insult to a person who is telling you the truth. It only feels like an accusation to the person who is not. He had trained me to read basic self-protection as distrust, and I had complied because I wanted to be trusted in return, and somewhere I had confused the direction of the thing, confused proving you trust him with trusting him, which are not the same and in fact run in opposite directions. Proving you trust someone looks like lowering your guard. Actually trusting someone looks like feeling free to check, because you are not afraid of what you'll find. I was afraid of what I would find. I had been afraid of it since the restaurant. I just called it something else. The last thing I'll say is about the women who text me after videos like this one. Not all of them. Most people don't send messages. They leave a comment or nothing. But sometimes someone slides into the DMs and the message starts with, "I know this is about something else, but..." And then they describe their version of the thing. The details are always different. The structure is always the same. The person they are with makes them feel seen in private and invisible in public. The explanations are always available and always reasonable. The one time they raised it, the conversation turned around, and they ended up apologizing. They have a key or they don't have a key. They have met the friends or they haven't. The stakes are different in the specifics, but the fundamental shape of the thing is identical. There is a door. And only one person has the key to it. And it opens inward, and the other person has been standing on their side of it for long enough that they've started to believe that's where they belong. I don't have advice, exactly. I don't know their situations, and I've proven to myself that I can misread a situation for 4 months while believing I was reading it clearly. So I hold my own judgment loosely these days. But what I want to say to the person who is mid-explanation right now, who is in the car, assembling the reasons, is this. The first version was probably right. Not because people are always guilty. Not because trust is naive. But because your body knows before your mind gives it permission. And the labor of overruling your body is not love. It is the cost of the lie transferred to you for safekeeping. And you have been carrying it faithfully. You don't have to carry it anymore.